Right in. Our first speaker today is Professor Jonathan Jansen. He's a distinguished professor of education at the University of Stellenbosch and the president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He will speak about what he learned about learning under lockdown from 620 students.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. So I have, during the lockdown, decided to do two community projects. One of which was focused on getting children from grades R through 12 to share in public the experiences of what we call lockdown learning. We gave them some prompts along the way to suggest things they could do, write about, such as, for example, whether they had access to online facilities to begin with, and how they might have grappled with that technology, working from home. We talked to them about, or gave them prompts around family dynamics and all of that that come into play. And I thought we might get about 100 stories. It turned out we got from around the country, all 9 provinces, and indeed from a few outside the country, 640 stories submitted. Obviously, that was too much for us to put in a book, so we chose, my team and I chose 400. The book is called Learning Under Lockdown, Voices of South Africa's Children. It should be in all the CNA bookstores from Tuesday or Wednesday onwards next week. What I then realized was, once we got all the stories and we read each and every one of them and did some analysis of the stories, that there were 6 or 7 themes that came through that were very, very powerful and had implications both for research and policy, but also for practice when it came to learning from a distance. And so I applied to the university's ethics committee to do a retrospective analysis of those stories, which were not intended originally as a research project, in order to see whether we could generate some policy ideas that could help the departments of education in the provinces, the schools, principals and teachers, and of course families and children. So what I thought I would share with you today is just 3 or 4 of the issues that might be germane to this kind of discussion group of mathematics professors and students, and looking at that very much from the perspective of somebody who studies schools for a living, and teaching and learning in particular. So the first thing that really struck me in the stories from the perspective of the students was how often they spoke about space and learning. In other words, you're suddenly transferred from a classroom into a home. And that home is a particular kind of space because it is populated often by parents, populated by siblings, and in particular younger siblings, toddlers, and so on, populated after the next phase of the lockdown also by the domestic workers, farm laborers, and so on in some cases. And suddenly this space for learning becomes quite crowded out, with a whole lot of people demanding attention. And the first thing, of course, that comes up is, where do we put all of the people in different workspaces? The parents who are working, if they're not essential workers going out, they're working in the home. The siblings, if they're at school, where do they study? In the home, and who does what when, and this becomes very tricky, especially when you share a table or share a room with another sibling. It becomes even more complex when there's a toddler, and that toddler demands attention from everyone present. And so one of the things we've not looked at, obviously, it's we've not had a pandemic of this scale and of this kind since 100 years ago. If you overlook HIV/AIDS, which has a very different kind of dynamic in homes, this is lockdown as a result of a pandemic that enforces particular configurations of space. Now, I'm not even talking about people who live in a shack and for whom space, social distancing is a joke, right? I mean, you simply can't do social distancing in the context of a very crowded space, and that has implications as well for learning. So the spatial element, I think, is something that we need to dig a lot deeper into. And based on this and other issues that emerged, I will share with you a paper that I've just published called Data or Bread. And it's really a policy analysis of the students' stories as data. The second thing that came up and that I thought you might find very interesting is that there's about 20 different references to mathematics in particular in the way the students tell their stories about lockdown learning. And I was curious about that because they didn't mention my subject, which is the life sciences or biology in particular. They didn't mention, much about English literature and all of that. What they mentioned, what they brought up was mathematics. And the thing that several students pointed out was that they missed the math teacher the most. And I've been racking my head to try and figure out why is it that mathematics, of all these 7 or 8 subjects a kid might do, would feature so prominently. And this is something, obviously, I would quite, enthusiastically give over to those of you who are mathematicians, because it seems to me there's something in the subject itself, number one, but something in the teaching of the subject that made the learning of mathematics particularly stressful for a lot of the kids in lockdown. And I want to propose 2 things. I have no detailed evidence for this, but certainly what I picked up so far, I would want to test. These might be my hypotheses if we had to go a bit further into this particular study. The one is, I think, is that mathematics is not as easily resolved, a mathematical problem, by referring back to a text. In other words, what math allows through the direct presence of a teacher in pre-lockdown conditions is I can ask the teacher, and the teacher will give me an immediate answer to the fraction or the algebraic equation, whatever the case might be, and the problem is solved and I move on. That's, of course, not true, certainly, for the history curriculum or for geography and so on, where you could more easily, perhaps do some self-referencing and all of that. The second hypothesis that I have is that a lot of mathematics learning, certainly true in my own biography, is social learning. And this is a huge thing. In other words, it's when young people sit together and solve a problem together, as many of them, in fact, shared in their stories, that the social aspects of learning come out much more prominently. Now, why is this important? It is important because in educational theory and practice, the assumption often made, and with some justification, is that learning is an individualized activity. Certainly the way in which we assess in most of our schools, and indeed in most of the world's schools, is through some kind of final assessment, examination-based assessments. Seldom do we do group work, even though from time to time in curriculum reform there's sort of an upsurge of group work as an idea. But by and large, final assessments at university, final assessments in school system is made on the basis of individual performance. It turns out, certainly what we find in these stories is that many of these students, in fact, when they are at school and when they work after school, do the resolution of problems on the basis of groups. So when you take away the formal, steady, well-paced, timetabled learning of a subject like mathematics, and you suddenly put a person behind a screen at home in a context that is often crowded, then that kind of shared learning, the social basis for learning, is largely taken away. And then thirdly, we have many speakers, so I don't want to take too much time. Let me just mention one other aspect that I also found fascinating, and that is the really important role of what sociologists call cultural capital, the role that cultural capital plays in the, in uninterrupted learning, in the more privileged homes. And so there's a lot of evidence in this book of a mother who's a teacher or a father who's an engineer being able to help the grade 11 kid with aspects of mathematics, to give that person their own room, to work. In fact, in one case, there's a child at a fancy school in Pietermaritzburg, whose father works with him on, big data questions, and they publish together. Now, that's a completely different world, a world in which, the education levels of your parents, the job experiences of your parents, the motivation of your parents enables you to actually, and then, of course, the fact that you're at a school in which you already pre-lockdown had some form of blended learning, if not also, a very good dose of online learning, in addition to face-to-face, that those kids actually will streak much further ahead. So you already have an unequal school system. There's a lot of, we just published a book last year on this in very fine detail. We already have this huge gap. Regardless of what happens between now and the end of the year, that gap will certainly increase even further, because here's the other side of the picture, and with this I conclude, and that is that there's a whole lot of kids who have had no access to even print material, no access to the erratic broadcast education materials. And when I say erratic, it's not CAPS compliant, or at least running with the school curriculum. And secondly, it's at odd times of the day, like 5 in the morning, when some of these programs come on, and most of it on SABC, which means, of course, it's analog. And those kids just don't stand a chance, regardless of what you do. And then in the middle, there's the group of kids who may have data occasionally, a device, if shared with a parent, but all of this is intermittent, and dependent very, very much on availability from one day to the next. So for those two, so the only people who really get digital education and synchronous online education are those in 20% of our schools, who will do fairly well in terms of learning outcomes compared to the other two categories. So I thought it would be important to share that, because quite apart from the health aspects, which is a completely different debate about when schools should reopen, and I don't believe they should reopen. It's crazy to reopen schools when community spread is high and we've not yet peaked. It's not yet October, best estimates. And where a lot of teachers in the schools I used to work in and learning look like me. They have comorbidities, they are in packed classrooms, there's no material, there's no space in which to enforce mitigating measures of the kind that would work. But that's a separate debate. I thought I'll just give you a little bit of a window through the eyes of 640 students, 400 of which are published, giving a bit of a sense of the complexities of learning under lockdown for different kinds of schools and different kinds of families. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, you mentioned that social interaction is very important in terms of learning mathematics. Now, I want to ask you, do you think that social interaction is more important than having a language to teach mathematics?
Just say a word or two more on what you mean by having a language.
Okay, so I started teaching a boy, who's in grade 9, and I'm teaching him mathematics, but he knows zero English. He can only speak Sesotho. But I can speak zero Sesotho, and I can speak English. But we have we are able to socially interact. So is it crazy for me to think that I'm able to teach him mathematics without having a language?
Okay,
And
I
just
see what you
using
mean.
social interaction.
Yes, look, I think you have a language that is shared, actually. You might not be aware of it. And that language is mathematics. Remember, mathematics for children is an additional language, okay? And I was always, when I was a graduate student in another country, in the US, one of the things that always fascinated me was that the best students in engineering were students from Asian countries like China. When I met, as an international student, met these Chinese students, they didn't understand a word of English, but they were always the top scorers in mathematics and in physics and so on. And that is because when you looked at that paper or that board or whatever it was you were teaching with, you know, x squared equals y squared plus z squared is the same language, you know. So I would not be perturbed at all if you are teaching a child with whom you don't have a shared language, because I do believe that the language of mathematics is something that I have seen in contexts where people had no English, in English medium universities, doing very, very well because the concepts are shared. A squared is A squared in almost any, you know, social or cultural context. That having been said, and yeah, I refer to the math education people, which are not math people per se, and there seems to be a whole lot of research that says in the course of teaching almost any subject, you are, whether you like it or not, also a language teacher, okay? And so I'm very conscious of the fact that when I teach, whether it is sort of teaching right now, or whether I teach my postgrad students, or whether I'm teaching a first year class, I'm very conscious of the fact that the way in which, given that the students there have very different languages, even at a place like Stellenbosch, I'm very conscious of the fact that the way in which I speak the language of instruction itself has an impact on language learning. So there's a nice coincidental piece of learning that's taking place, which is language learning. But I would argue it is not a barrier to teaching a subject. It would be a barrier if you taught geography and history, that I guarantee you. But because math in some ways is its own language, I don't think it is as big a hurdle to scale. So good luck.
Thank you.